As I begin the sermon this morning, I want to invite you to imagine with me two different worlds, taking a moment to envision these in your mind's eye. The first of these worlds is a harsh one, a world of scarcity and depletion. In this world, the Earth's rhythms have undergone seismic shifts. The seasons, climate, and weather patterns are unfamiliar, unpredictable, and even devastating. More and more natural disasters, floods, droughts, and storms ravage the land and seas. And in turn, agriculture has been deeply impacted, with poor yields and weathered crops, limited supply chains where food, once in abundance, is now scarce. Forests have been cleared in the name of larger areas for farmland and grazing livestock. The atmosphere and air is filled with pollution and methane, byproducts of this widening imbalance of the planet. This is a world of hunger, where fresh foods are harder and harder to come by, with an increasing reliance on highly processed foods. Landscapes are barren and cracked, the soil dry and empty. The web of life has had to spin new spindles as it adapts to this harsh reality, irreparably changed forever. As we hold this first frightening world in our mind's eye, let us imagine a different world, a world of both abundance and plenty. A world where the shifting season hearken Earth's natural rhythms. This world too has seen seismic shifts, yet these shifts have caused a greater balance and steadiness for our planet. Violent storms and natural disasters occur with less frequency and might. The lands are lush and vibrant with greenery. Water runs through these lands in bursting streams, bringing life and biodiversity for all of Earth's creatures. Human beings are not the subduers of the land as they once were. Instead, they've become stewards of this shared world. Land once removed of trees and animals has been reclaimed, cultivated by people less obsessed with exploitation and profit. This new world enjoys the riches of plenty, of fresh fruits and vegetables, of foods rich in nutrients that are available to all. In this world, no person goes hungry. In fact, hunger and famine are words from a far distant past. The world's cultures and communities collaborate to preserve and defend the planet from further harm. And oppressive systems and outlooks themselves have been transformed. In this world, we see a dwelling place for the web of life in all of its fullness, where all may receive the blessings of peace, liberty, and justice. And in this world, we are sustained by our sustaining. And in turn, the whole world is transformed into a land flowing with the riches of abiding love and connection. Which of these worlds is most familiar to you? With both of these worlds, we are presented with lands in stark contrast to one another. In many ways, preaching about these two lands feels almost like fire and brimstone preaching. In one, we see a land of suffering and torment, and in the other, a land of paradise and goodness. And though I wish this were just an episode of The Twilight Zone, the frightening truth about these worlds is that we know them both. Though one of these might sound more familiar than the other, there are places on this earth where abundance and supply chains flow in plenty. And likewise, there are places of incredible scarcity and hunger, far removed from what many of us know in our own lived experiences. Places where people are thirsty and hungry, and food is not shared. Yes, we live in a reality where the truth is we know both of these worlds. And though as removed we may feel from either the pain and the suffering or the abundance and the plenty, we will all be affected by our changing climate. Our world is one world. What touches one affects us all. On this United Nations Sunday, we're exploring this year's theme from the UUA's office at the United Nations. This year's theme, All In for Climate Justice, Food Equity, and Sustainability. It's a theme that is especially relevant in this world as we get more and more of these glimpses of that world of scarcity, where we are seeing strains on supply chains because of the pandemic, leaving some without necessary resources, where natural and devastating disasters are a more regular occurrence. The UUNO, United Nations Office, has played an important role in representing our faith and values to the wider United Nations. Even since the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UUNO has been involved in issues facing our global world. The office has been steady global leaders and advocates for human rights, as well as promoting international cooperation and world community. And while we sometimes don't hear about this work of the UUNO, it's important to understand why we value this work as a faith. The UUNO is a direct line that stems from our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And historically speaking, promoting a sense of world community is something that comes from both branches of our faith, not something that is new to us today. Our Unitarian and our Universalist forebears, especially those of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were passionate about a social gospel message. They believed that salvation itself was not something that could be left up to divine guarantees. In other words, this life itself matters, and loving the hell out of this world is more important than abandoning it for some far-off paradise. More importantly, what we do in this life matters, and that we must be the ones to do the work of justice ourselves. Prophetic voices like that of the Unitarian minister John Holmes and the Universalist minister Clarence Skinner advocated for a world of tomorrow, a world of love, siblinghood, and compassion. They believed that a world of abundance and plenty was still possible, even in the shadows of worldwide war, disease, and escalating conflict. And another prophetic voice that still speaks to our Unitarian Universalist vision of world community is also that of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Though not a Unitarian Universalist, his preaching on a beloved community of all peoples and nations is one that continues on in our Unitarian Universalist faith today. King popularized the term beloved community in the 1960s civil rights movement. And in many ways, we might also credit him for giving Unitarian Universalism a far greater sense of what our sixth principle looks like. King was increasingly concerned with what he called the three evils facing our world. He named these as poverty, racism, and militarism. According to King, each and any of these were enemies to the beloved community. And he spoke prophetically to humanity's restlessness for a world free from these three evils. In a 1956 speech that he gave to the New York State Convention of Universalists, he remarked, "This determination to struggle until segregation and discrimination have passed away springs from the same longing for human dignity that motivates oppressed peoples all over the world. This is not a nation in transition, but a world in transition." King was critical of the ways in which capitalism, oppression, and obsessions with greed, violence, and profit were affecting our world, especially those who are the most vulnerable and marginalized among us. King spoke to a great revolution that he believed the world was on the brink of, a world intent on alleviating the pains of discrimination, injustice, and suffering. In his view, the world simply could not continue on in the ways that it had been. Instead, King believed that a climate and a human rights revolution was in our very midst, a revolution that he believed all were called to witness to. In sharing these prophetic words from King, as well as these ideas from social gospel Unitarians and Universalists, I want to underscore what this means for our faith today. As we hold faith in a world community, we also recognize that this is a vision that isn't just for some of us on this earth. We recognize that peace, liberty, and justice must exist together, that there can be no true peace without liberty and justice, just as there can be no true justice without liberty and peace. And likewise, liberty is not true liberty without also the guarantees of both peace and justice. We recognize that all of these must exist and that each of these begets the world that we wish to create, the beloved community. Our universalism gives us a rich vision for what it means to understand salvation and for what it means to be all in. Universal salvation itself, a historic belief that all would be saved and that no person was worthy of eternal suffering, is a modern vision for world community in the here and now. Our universalism teaches that indeed we're all in because we must be. There is no saving one without the other. We can either be all in willingly and proactively, or all in inevitably. Universal salvation teaches a collective salvation in this life, that we're all affected by what we choose to do and how we live our lives for others. While we've spoken a lot about a macro focus on these issues, we can see the direct impacts of a changing climate and food scarcity in parts of our own country, and even in our own communities. In fact, in the United States, racism and injustice are built into the very DNA of our own food system. From the genocide and colonization of these lands from indigenous peoples, as well as the kidnapping and enslavement of Black people from the shores of West Africa, agriculture itself has become an apartheid system. A system where farming management has become an increasingly white profession, while farm labor itself is predominantly brown. Communities of color live in what are called food apartheid neighborhoods, with increasing rates of diet-related illness due to a lack of access to healthful foods. While we see a world in need of a revolution, we see the pangs of a country in need of a revolution. And our current food system is a system of haves and also have-nots. It's a system where Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color are continuously exploited in a system built on both stolen land and stolen labor. Yes, we must change this. We are in need of a great revolution. What touches one affects us all. In our Time for All Ages that Betsy shared for us, we see a king who cared for nobody else but himself. Living in a land of abundance, the king thrived as his subjects became poorer and poorer. A table laden with good food, the king lived so far removed from the hunger and thirst of those in the world. It's not until a hunter and the dog come that the things are finally changed. With a bark that roars of thunder, the king realizes that he cannot live removed from the pain of the world any longer. The dog continues to bark so long as even one person is hungry, so long as injustice continues to persist. In the end, the king finally understands the meaning of justice, and the kingdom is transformed and the oppressions facing the people become no more. We get a glimpse of that better world that's possible, a world of both abundance and plenty, a beloved community where none are hungry and thirsty, and where injustice is no more. Dear ones, this story teaches us that we must be the ones to bring about the great revolution, that same revolution of our country and world that King preached about. We must be stubborn like the dog to bark out against injustice over and over again in order to change this world where some live in plenty while others go hungry. We must raise our voices against those who threaten this earth and all those who see it as something to be exploited rather than stewarded. We must show up for each other and each person, knowing that we're all in it for this future that's ahead of us. And we must show up while there is still a different world that is possible, while we still have a choice between those two worlds, between both abundance and scarcity. So how can we make a difference? How can we create the better world, the world of abundance and plenty that we so desperately hope for? We must start local, supporting the work of climate and food justice in our area. This involves raising awareness of the ever-present climate crisis and encouraging others to also take action. This involves transitioning our farming techniques to sustainable ones, for opting for more plant-based diets and foods over resource-intensive foods like meat and dairy. We must also think in terms of national and global. We must advocate for systemic change through political action, advocating for environmental shifts on a large scale. We must also look to organizations like the United Nations Office and the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, both of whom not only represent our faith, but also work to empower global communities on their terms rather than ours. There is so much that needs to be done, and indeed there is so much that is required of us to do in order to build this world that is still possible. To close, I want to revisit the words from our reading that Nan read for us in History's Road. In this prayer, we are reminded of the long road ahead of us, a road that has been paved with pasts of violence and exploitation. Yet we are also reminded of our global village, of a growing realization of our own interconnectedness, of our connections to each other and to all of creation. We are reminded of prophets and stewards who have barked at injustice and shown us different ways of living, of Isaiah and Tubman, of Gandhi and Chief Seattle, of Skinner, Holmes, and King. We are also reminded of the prophets and stewards in our own midst, within this greater prophethood of all believers that we affirm in our living tradition. May we join this great cloud of witnesses to greet a new day breaking, a day of promise for a world flowing with streams of peace, liberty, and justice. And as our reading says, may we increasingly know this new life, the way of peace and justice, the way of justice lived according to the way of peace, the beloved community. May this vision of the beloved world community be ours now and forevermore, until every person is fed, until the oppressed are free from what oppresses them, until all of us are all in for this future that is possible. May it be so, and amen.